Thank you for joining us today on Earthfile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. It is now indisputable that human influence has warmed the climate system, raising global surface temperature, and this has resulted in many extreme conditions like heavy rainfall and drought. This was confirmed this week in the latest report by the Working Group 1 contribution to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The report shows that greenhouse gas emissions from human activities are responsible for approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming since 1850 to 1900, and finds that over the next 20 years, the global temperature is expected to reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. The IPCC's report comes just 3 months before a major United Nations conference in Glasgow, Scotland, where nations will be under pressure to pledge ambitious climate action and substantial financing. We look at the findings today on Earthfile and how this affects you. Just stay with us. For more than 6 decades, the cocoa that Richard Mbasiga harvested from his plantation in central Cameroon faithfully paid for everything his family needed. Irregular rainfall and prolonged dry seasons have since sucked the moisture from the soil, killed cocoa trees and cut the yield from his farm. Now unable to fill even a single bag with beans, 77-year-old Richard struggles just to buy soap with a harvest that once put his children through school.
Il y avait la sécheresse pendant 4 mois. Vous voyez comme ça là, tout est brûlé.
There has been 4 months of drought. You see here, everything is scorched. This used to be a productive plantation. Now everything is scorched. 3 hectares are destroyed because of the drought. I present to you my 3-hectare plantation. How am I going to live with my family?
Comment je veux vivre avec ma famille? Il n'y a rien ici. C'est le bois.
Prolonged dry seasons linked to climate change in Cameroon has made poor harvest a new reality for many cocoa farmers who farm in small individual holdings. Due to changing weather patterns, Africa's 3rd largest cocoa producer, behind Ivory Coast and Ghana, has struggled to meet a long-term target of boosting cocoa output to over 300,000 tons annually.
J'ai défriché au moins 2000 hectares. Les autres hectares sont abandonnés.
I cleared at least 2 hectares. The rest is abandoned. I'm discouraged to clear it. I'm discouraged to clear the 2.5 hectares left here.
Les 2 hectares et demi qui sont restés, je suis découragé pour défricher.
He says the country now struggles to reach 250,000 tons and that farmers are struggling to even produce 500 kilograms per hectare, compared to 1 ton per hectare a few years back.
Auparavant, je faisais 15 sacs.
I used to produce 15 bags per year, and now I can't even get 1 bag. You see, I can't produce a bag. I can't.
Je ne peux plus avoir, vous voyez, hein, je ne peux pas avoir un sac. Je ne peux pas.
Cocoa trees thrive in humid equatorial areas that experience predictable bouts of sunshine and heavy rain, like West and Central Africa, where about 70% of the world's beans currently come from. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said in its intensive report that the change in climate patterns could have negative impact on export earnings on which the countries depend on. Small-scale farmers like Richard feel the heat more than anyone. Javier Antangara, who used to grow cocoa in the same area, is drying his latest harvest, much less than he used to, for August, he says.
That's because the dry season lasted more than 6 months here in Kengwe. That's why we don't have enough cocoa at the moment. In August, I should have 3 sheets like this one. But this year, as you can see, we do what we can.
After clearing his cocoa field, he is now planning to grow tomatoes, a crop that grows faster and one that he hopes will help send his children to school and look after his family. Farmers will have to adapt to the changing climate patterns by no longer following strict seasons and farming methods, but regularly observing crops and working in cooperatives to reduce costs. Already, greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere are high enough to guarantee climate disruption for decades, if not centuries. In other words, the deadly heat waves, massive hurricanes and other weather extremes that are already happening will only become more severe. 8 years after the last assessment report on the physical science of climate change released to the world, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says modern society's continued dependence on fossil fuels is warming the world at a pace that is unprecedented in the past 2,000 years. And its effects are already apparent as record droughts, wildfires and floods devastate communities worldwide. This report is the culmination of a marathon 5-year assessment, writing, review and approval process from 234 leading scientists hailing from more than 60 countries. These scientists have worked together to rigorously evaluate the world's climate change research papers, more than 14,000 of them.
This report will serve as a timely new evidence base for negotiators at the COP26 negotiations starting in less than 3 months. It will be a valuable toolbox for negotiators as they consider the level of ambition at COP26 and together with the rest of the 6th assessment report as they prepare for the global stocktake. This report, Climate Change 2021, the physical science basis, expands our knowledge of attribution of climate change, including the human contribution to extreme weather events. And it provides us with an improved understanding of climate change, including warming, past, present, and future. First, it tells us that it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change and making extreme weather events more frequent and severe. Second, it shows that climate change is affecting every region on our planet. And lastly, it explains that strong, rapid, sustained reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions would be required to limit global warming.
If global emission hits net zero by around 2050, a target that many countries have committed to over the past year, then the world can achieve the goal laid out in the 2015 Paris Accord and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels over the course of the 21st century.
The report allows the society, to move away from that perfect perception that we are shifting from a sane zone to one where we experience dramatic changes everywhere overnight. The report clearly shows that we are living the consequences already of climate change everywhere, but furthermore, that we will experience further and concurrent and multiple changes that increase with every additional bit of warming. We should be prepared for that.
Right now, carbon dioxide concentration, which causes global warming, is at the highest in 2 million years. There is the fastest sea level rise in 3,000 years. Arctic ice has melted to its lowest level in 1,000 years, and glaciers are retreating in an unprecedented rate.
If you think of a 1.5 warmer world, our report shows that we need to be prepared for going into that level of warming in the coming decades. But we can avoid further levels of warming by acting on greenhouse gas emissions, and that's also a very important message from the report. When you look at regional information, when you look at how the climate system operates, there's no a single line, where before that you avoid change and after that you have a very fast change. What we show in this report is that with any increment of further warming, you have further trends in temperature, precipitation in every region, further melt of glaciers, of Arctic sea ice, further increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme events. And this is the information we provide to decision makers so that they carefully consider the choices that they would like to make regarding climate change.
The report highlights that cutting global emissions starting immediately to net zero by mid-century will give a good chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius in the long term and help to avoid the worst effect of climate change.
The warmer the air gets, the more water it can hold. So by the laws of physics, with every degree of heating the air, it can take 7% more water. And that means in a 1 degree warmer world, the atmosphere is going to contain those 7% more water, and they ultimately will rain out. And with every degree warmer, these extreme rainfalls particularly will be enhanced. So actually, if we continue emitting as we are currently, we will certainly exceed 2 degrees of warming. And even the pledges that have recently been made will only get us to something slightly above 2 degrees warming by the end of this century. So in order to limit climate change below 2 degrees of warming, we need much more stringent action. We need to stop CO2 emissions by the mid of this century. And we also need to reduce the emission of other greenhouse gases, such as methane, in order to make sure that we can stay well below 2 degrees centigrade.
The overall assessment underscores efforts to pin down how much more temperatures will rise if atmospheric emissions continue, and provides climate scientists most confident projections yet for the 21st century. One key metric that researchers use to make their projections is climate sensitivity, a measure of how much long-term warming would be expected on Earth from a doubling of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations compared with pre-industrial levels.
The report is very clear that with further warming in the coming years, we expect to see new extremes that are unprecedented in magnitude, frequency, timing, or in regions that have never encountered those types of extremes. And I think an important aspect that is shared by all the authors of this report, all the scientists, is that, for decision-making worldwide, many people just look backwards. What was the extreme event of the last 30 years, of the last 100 years? But in a changing climate, that is not sufficient. It's really important to take into account these new types of extremes, these intensified extremes that are going to happen in the coming years or decades. And let me finish by one example. With gradual sea level rise, the extreme sea level events that occurred in the past just once per century will occur more and more frequently in the future. For most coastal places worldwide, those that occurred only once per century in the past are expected to occur once to twice per 10 years by mid-century. And the information we provide in this report is extremely important to take this information into account and to prepare for these events.
Although the IPCC's best estimate remains at 3 degrees Celsius, the report reduces the uncertainty in that figure, narrowing the probable range to 2.5 to 4 degrees Celsius, using evidence such as modern and ancient climate records. This compares with 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius, the wider range for sensitivity reported in the IPCC's last climate assessment released in 2013. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report warns that we are dangerously close to breaching Paris goals of limiting average global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but that 1.5 degrees Celsius is still within reach.
It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, land, and the ocean. That means something like the human activity is influence not only temperature, but the whole climate system. And when we put all the literature and so many authors together, then we see the whole picture for the Earth system, the climate system, and that is quite strong. I think much stronger than AR5, which we said something like the attribution, more than half of the warming attributed to the human causes. I think that's another advances. And also we see climate change is already affecting all the regions on Earth in multiple ways. I think that's also something like influence everybody. We live in the Earth, and also they report clearly state that it is possible to limit future warming within a few decades.
G7 leaders reaffirmed their commitment to 1.5 degrees Celsius in Cadiz Bay in the United Kingdom in May. After that, the G20 environmental ministers failed to agree on wording around the Paris goals. A similar signal is on the table for the G20 leaders meeting in October.
We have made progress. We've seen all the G7 countries, the big G7 economies, come forward with ambitious plans to cut emissions in the near term and also on a trajectory to net zero by 2050. But of course, we need all countries to come forward, particularly the G20 nations. They together represent 80% of global emissions, 85% of the global economy, and that's why we need to see further action from them.
For more than 3 decades, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been warning. The world listened, but obviously did not hear, and runaway greenhouse gas effect has wreaked havoc across the world.
The world listened, but it did not act strongly enough. And as a result, climate change is a problem that is here now. Nobody's safe, and it's getting worse faster. We must treat climate change as an immediate threat, just as we must treat the connected crisis of nature and biodiversity loss and pollution and waste as immediate threats. As recently noted in the IPCC and the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, the twin to IPCC, if you like, under the CBD Convention, we understand that climate change exacerbates already grave risks to biodiversity and natural managed habitats. Ecosystem degradation damages nature's ability to reduce the force of climate change. And as the IPCC Working Group 1 report reminds us, reducing greenhouse gases will not only slow climate change, but will improve air quality. It's all connected. It's time to get serious because every ton of CO2 emission adds to global warming. As the UNFCCC noted last week, 110 countries, just 110 out of 191 parties to the convention have submitted new or updated NDCs ahead of the next climate COP. Governments need to make their net zero plan an integral part of their Paris commitments. They must finance and support developing countries to adapt to climate change, as promised under the Paris Agreement. They must decarbonize faster. They must restore natural systems that draw down carbon, cut out methane and other greenhouse gases faster, get behind the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol to cut the climate impact of the cooling industry. And every business, every investor, and every citizen needs to play their part.
The science tells us that to limit the worst consequences of climate change, we must aim for the net zero as soon as possible, by 2050 at the very latest, and that we need rapid short-term decarbonization efforts this decade.
We can't undo the mistakes of the past, but this generation of political and business leaders, this generation of conscious citizens can make things right. This generation can make the systemic changes that will stop the planet warming, help everyone adapt to the new conditions, and create a world of peace, prosperity, and equity. Climate change is here now, but we are also here now. And if we don't act, who will?
Moreover, there is an increasing moral and economic imperative to respond to the consequences of climate change we are already witnessing. The poorest communities are often those that contribute the least to climate change but are most vulnerable to its consequences.
Element of the IPCC is, of course, that this approval session for the summary report for policymakers does include representatives of 195 member states of the IPCC. So in this approval, they already agree and make clear they are aware of our messages. So in that regard, we do think that the message is taken serious. I think the message now is extremely clear. We need to make drastic action. And if we do not, then every 1/10 of a degree of more warming will bring more extreme consequences with it. So I do think that message should be clear enough to take actions. It is also clear that if we act now, within the next 20 years, we will start to see a difference. And so it is no longer something that is extremely long-term and can be procrastinated. It is really something we need to do now.
Through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of Parties process, these countries are able to leverage their equal status to their richer counterparts as UNFCCC's parties to highlight the importance of climate adaptation and resilience.
But ultimately, of course, many of these actions come down to governments. It comes down to businesses who are stepping forward and playing their part in terms of going to net zero. And of course, in each of our lives, we can take actions as well in terms of cutting our emissions. But ultimately, this isn't about forcing people to go in a particular direction. This is about helping them, encouraging them. As I said, carrot rather than stick should be the approach. And this is a gradual transition that will take place over a number of years.
The overarching goal of COP26 President Alok Sharma is for the international community to come forward in Glasgow in November with a long-term emission reductions target, complemented by immediate short-term action to keep 1.5 degrees alive. As we have learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, prevention is better and far less costly than cure. The COP26 summit will be unprecedented in bringing business leaders into the global effort on climate change, and public-private collaboration will be key to achieving these dual goals of mitigating carbon emissions to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius alive and supporting all communities to adapt to and be resilient to climate change.
I'm always optimistic that we can get this done, but of course there's a lot of heavy lifting still to do between now and COP26, and I'm throwing the kitchen sink at this, Chris, I can tell you, to make sure that we get success at COP26. As I say to every government around the world, success at COP26 is going to belong to all of us, and ultimately we're doing this not just for current generations, but for future generations as well.
Let me finish by thanking.
Since its establishment in 1988, the IPCC has released 5 so-called assessment reports, updating the established science on climate change, its impact, future risks, and ways to tackle the problems. But the IPCC itself is not made up of scientists. The panel includes government representatives from 195 countries who commission assessment from experts and academics across the world. In drafting those assessments, scientists consider thousands of individual studies published since the last IPCC report. To finalize their latest assessment for the upcoming report, scientists met virtually with policymakers for 2 weeks between July and August, scrutinizing the details and language used in the report. The latest report is actually just part of what will go into the final 6th assessment report when it is released in 2022. But this latest chapter is one of the most highly anticipated, particularly after being delayed for months because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Unlike the previous assessments, the chapter uses 5 possible emissions trajectories the world could follow rather than the previous 4 scenarios. That's our show for today. Thank you for watching. We hope to be back with you next week. In the meantime, our inbox, earthfile@channelstv.com, is available for your comments and your questions. From all of us here in Lagos, it's bye for now.